Jake Dawson stared at himself in the mirror, struggling to recognize the man reflected back at him. The gray suit fit perfectly. The blue tie brought out the warm color of his brown eyes, but none of it masked the unease etched across his face. He took a deep breath, trying to block out the muffled whispers drifting in from the grand hall. A 19-year-old marrying a 75-year-old woman? It's got to be for the money. The words played over and over in his mind like a relentless drumbeat of judgment. He knew what everyone thought, but they didn't know his reality. Desperation had led him here, and desperation didn't leave many choices. Elizabeth Sinclair, regal and composed, moved gracefully across the room in an elegant white lace dress. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her posture remained strong despite the weight of countless prying eyes. She could feel the silent questions aimed at her. Why? Why him? Why now? At 75, Elizabeth was no stranger to gossip. But this time, something about it unsettled her. She wasn't just marrying for companionship. There were deeper reasons. Reasons that, if revealed, could shake everything. Jake wasn't merely a young man caught in circumstances. He was part of a plan that even he didn't fully understand yet. They had met by chance 2 months earlier in a small cafe downtown. Jake had been a struggling young waiter, barely keeping up with rent and drowning in debt. Elizabeth had been a wealthy but isolated woman, seeking some form of distraction from her lonely days. A strange connection blossomed between them. For Jake, the offer of marriage seemed like a lifeline out of poverty. For Elizabeth, it was something else entirely. Now, standing side by side in front of their guests, Jake couldn't shake the gnawing thought. What have I gotten myself into? After the ceremony ended, Elizabeth took Jake by the hand and led him to a private room at the back of the mansion. She closed the heavy wooden door behind them, and suddenly the atmosphere felt stifling. Jake's nerves tensed as her piercing gaze locked onto him. She stepped closer, her voice calm but eerily firm. Jake, I hope you know what you're doing, because from this point on, there's no turning back. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to steady. I know. I'm ready. Elizabeth smiled faintly, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. There was something almost ominous in it. Good. Just remember, this house holds more secrets than you think. That night, the mansion seemed even more vast and cold than before. Jake lay awake, his mind racing. Hours passed, and just as he began to drift off, a strange noise jolted him. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly down the corridor outside his room. He sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps grew fainter, but the eerie sense that he wasn't alone lingered. Jake quietly got out of bed and opened the door. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, bathed in dim, flickering light. No one was there, yet the air felt thick with unseen presence. His pulse quickened, and for the first time that day, true fear gripped him. Does this version capture the tension and drama you were looking for? Would you like to adjust anything? Are you enjoying this mysterious story? Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll find captivating plots that keep you hooked until the very end. Activate the notification bell so you won't miss any new episodes and uncover the unfolding of each secret. Your support helps us keep bringing more stories. Jake stood frozen in the doorway of his bedroom, staring down the dimly lit corridor. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was the kind of stillness that felt alive, pressing against his skin like a cold, invisible hand. He hesitated for a moment, listening intently. Nothing. Only the faint hum of the mansion's heating system. Maybe I'm just hearing things, he thought, though the unease gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. He stepped out into the hall, barefoot, his senses on high alert. The corridor stretched out like a tunnel, with shadows dancing softly on the walls as the overhead lights flickered. Jake's footsteps were muted by the thick, ornate carpet beneath him. He walked slowly, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, as if expecting someone or something to appear. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Just as he turned a corner, he heard a faint creak, like the sound of a door opening somewhere in the distance. His breath hitched. Who else would be awake at this hour? He followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The mansion seemed endless at night, with its maze of hallways and towering ceilings. He eventually reached a large set of double doors he hadn't noticed before. One of the doors was slightly ajar, and from inside came a faint rustling sound. Jake hesitated, heart pounding in his chest. He could leave, go back to bed, pretend none of this was happening. But something compelled him to push the door open. The room beyond was a vast study, its walls lined with towering shelves full of dusty books. As he stepped inside, the rustling stopped. Jake's eyes scanned the room, taking in the dim glow of a single desk lamp near the center. Papers were scattered across the surface, and an old leather chair sat turned away from him. Slowly, he approached the desk, his footsteps echoing faintly in the cavernous room. He reached for one of the papers, but before he could read it, a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Jake jumped, spinning around to see Elizabeth standing in the doorway. Her face was partially shadowed, her expression unreadable. I heard something," Jake stammered, feeling foolish under her gaze. "This house makes a lot of noise," Elizabeth said quietly, stepping into the room. "It's old. You'll get used to it." She walked past him and began gathering the papers from the desk with methodical precision. Jake watched her in silence, sensing that there was more to her words than she let on. As she finished organizing the documents, she turned to face him fully, her eyes dark and serious. "This place holds many memories, Jake. Some of them linger. It's best not to wander around at night." Jake wanted to press her for answers, but something in her tone made him hesitate. Instead, he nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle uncomfortably in his chest. As she led him back to the main hall, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. Something that could change everything he thought he knew about this arrangement, and about Elizabeth herself. Jake awoke with a start, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of those footsteps or Elizabeth's eerie warning in the study. For a moment, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. What is this place hiding? He needed answers, but something told him they wouldn't come easily. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was a labyrinth of secrets, and Jake now found himself caught in the middle of it. At breakfast, the sunroom was drenched in light, but the warmth didn't ease Jake's tension. Elizabeth was already seated, her posture flawless, as she delicately sipped from a china teacup. Jake hesitated, then quietly took a seat across from her. She smiled faintly, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" she asked with a calm tone. Not really," Jake admitted. He wanted to ask about the study, about the footsteps, but he hesitated. Instead, he cautiously added, "This house feels different at night." Elizabeth didn't flinch, but her gaze sharpened slightly. "It's an old house," she said softly. "It holds onto its history." They fell into a tense silence. Jake could sense that she wasn't going to give him any direct answers, so he tried to steer the conversation another way. "You mentioned memories yesterday. What did you mean by that?" Elizabeth's face grew distant, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. "This house has seen many things, Jake. Some of them stay with it. You'll learn that in time. But not all truths are meant to be uncovered," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet finality. Jake's curiosity burned stronger, but he knew better than to push further. Elizabeth was clearly protecting something that terrified her more than she let on. Later that day, Jake wandered the mansion, his thoughts racing. He found himself returning to the corridor where he had heard the footsteps. The double doors to the study were closed now. He hesitated before pushing one of them open. The room was just as he had left it, dim, cold, and vast. But this time, something new caught his eye. A framed photograph on the desk. Slowly, Jake approached it. The picture showed a young Elizabeth standing beside a man he didn't recognize. They both smiled in the photo, but there was a strange melancholy in their expressions. As Jake leaned in for a closer look, a loud creak echoed behind him. He froze. The study door had swung shut. Jake's heart pounded as he spun around. There was no one there. The room seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. Something wasn't right. He wasn't alone. Jake's breathing quickened as he scanned the dimly lit study. The door had shut on its own, but there was no sign of anyone else. He hesitated, telling himself it might have been a draft, though deep down he didn't believe it. The silence was oppressive, as if the very walls were listening. Slowly, he approached the door, placed his hand on the handle, and twisted. It wouldn't budge. His pulse quickened. Locked. From the outside, Jake took a step back, his mind racing. Turning around, he glanced back at the photograph on the desk. It still sat there, its presence oddly unsettling. He picked it up and examined it more closely. The man next to Elizabeth looked vaguely familiar. There was something in his eyes, something cold and distant. Beneath the frame, Jake noticed a small inscription etched into the wood. Edward Sinclair, 1965. Sinclair. Was he her late husband? Jake had heard vague mentions of Elizabeth's past, but no one ever spoke about her husband in detail. Before he could think further, he heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the far corner of the room. "Leave, now." Jake froze, his eyes snapping toward the direction of the sound. The corner was shrouded in darkness, the bookshelves casting long, eerie shadows. He couldn't see anyone, but the whisper had been unmistakable. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response, just the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath him. He took a cautious step forward, heart hammering in his chest. As he moved closer, the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the corner in darkness. A sudden gust of cold air sent a shiver down his spine, as if something unseen had brushed past him. The door behind him suddenly flew open with a loud bang, breaking the tension. Jake jumped, spinning around to see Elizabeth standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Jake, what are you doing in here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "The door locked. I couldn't get out," Jake replied, trying to steady his voice. Elizabeth stepped inside, her gaze hardening as she glanced around the room. She moved to the desk and snatched up the photograph, her expression tightening. "This room is off limits. You shouldn't have come here," she said coldly. "I didn't mean to. I just heard something," Jake muttered, confused by her sudden intensity. Elizabeth's eyes softened slightly, but the tension remained. "There are things in this house you don't understand," she said quietly. "For your own good, stay away from this room." Without another word, she turned and led him out of the study. As they walked back through the corridor, Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time. The study door creaked shut behind them, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. The following days passed slowly, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about the study and the photograph of Edward Sinclair. Every time he crossed the corridors of the mansion, he felt the presence of something unseen. The whispers from that night echoed in his mind, keeping him awake at night. Elizabeth, on the other hand, acted as though nothing had happened. She avoided any mention of the study, focusing instead on household matters and distant conversations. Jake was growing more restless by the hour. What is she hiding? And why does this house feel alive at night? One evening, Jake decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers. While Elizabeth was out in the garden supervising the staff, Jake slipped away toward the east wing of the mansion. He remembered hearing rumors from the housekeepers about a hidden basement that no one used anymore. Supposedly, it was where the Sinclair family stored records and artifacts from decades ago. If there were any clues about Edward or the mansion's secrets, that would be the place to find them. He eventually found a small, rusted door tucked behind a row of old furniture in an unused corridor. It creaked loudly as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The air grew colder with each step he took. The scent of damp wood and dust filled his nostrils, and his footsteps echoed ominously in the tight space. At the bottom of the staircase, he found himself in a long, low-ceilinged room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, documents, and photographs. A single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shifting shadows across the room. As he explored, Jake's eyes landed on a series of old newspaper clippings neatly preserved in a glass case. One headline caught his attention: "Prominent businessman Edward Sinclair dies under mysterious circumstances." Jake's pulse quickened as he scanned the article. It described Edward's sudden death in 1966, just 1 year after the photo on the desk had been taken. According to the report, he had drowned in the estate's large ornamental pond, though there were conflicting accounts about how it happened. Some witnesses claimed to have heard arguing near the water shortly before his body was found. Was it an accident or something else? Jake wondered, his mind racing. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts. It was the same whisper from the study, low and urgent. "Leave before it's too late." Jake spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The light above him flickered violently, casting chaotic shadows across the room. The door at the top of the stairs suddenly slammed shut, plunging the basement into near darkness. Jake stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. What the hell is going on here? As he frantically searched for an exit, the whisper came again, closer this time. What dark secret haunts this mansion? Why does Jake keep hearing those whispers? Share your thoughts in the comments. Could the mystery surrounding Edward Sinclair's past finally be uncovered? Drop your theories below. Jake's heart raced as the shadows seemed to close in around him. The basement was suffocating, the walls pressing inward as if the house itself wanted to trap him there. The whisper echoed again, impossibly close. "You shouldn't be here." He staggered toward the stairs, gripping the railing with shaking hands. The door at the top remained firmly shut. Jake fought to control his breathing and tried to focus. This can't be real, he thought, though fear coursed through his veins like ice. After several agonizing moments, the flickering light stabilized, casting the room into a dim but steady glow. Determined not to give in to panic, Jake returned to the clippings. He needed to understand what had happened to Edward Sinclair. As he rifled through the documents, he found a journal with worn leather binding. The handwriting inside was neat and methodical. It was Elizabeth's. Flipping through the pages, he found an entry dated shortly after Edward's death. "I knew it would end this way." He wouldn't listen. Now his shadow haunts this place. Just as I feared, Jake's stomach twisted. Shadow? Was Elizabeth implying that Edward's presence still lingered in the mansion? Footsteps echoed above him, breaking his concentration. For a moment, he thought it was Elizabeth returning early, but the steps were heavy, uneven, and deliberate. He froze, listening intently. The sound circled above, moving slowly toward the staircase. Jake's instincts screamed at him to hide. He ducked behind a large shelf as the footsteps grew louder. Then, with a slow creak, the door at the top of the stairs opened. He strained to see who or what was there, but all he could make out was a faint silhouette in the doorway. The figure didn't move, simply standing in eerie stillness. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, hoping the figure would vanish when he opened them again. But when he dared to peek, the silhouette was gone. The door remained open, inviting him to leave. Swallowing hard, Jake stepped cautiously out from behind the shelf. The silence was overwhelming. He hesitated only briefly before making his way back up the stairs, his every step slow and deliberate. He could feel unseen eyes watching him, urging him to leave faster. Reaching the top of the stairs, Jake exited the basement and slammed the door shut behind him. His hands trembled as he locked it. He leaned against the cold stone wall, his mind reeling. Whatever secrets Elizabeth was hiding, they were much darker than he had imagined. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion was alive with something, or someone. Edward's shadow, he thought grimly. He needed to confront Elizabeth soon. But as the oppressive silence returned to the hallway, Jake realized that whatever truth he uncovered might be more dangerous than he was ready to face. That night, Jake paced anxiously in his bedroom. The journal entry replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. His shadow haunts this place. Elizabeth knew something, and she had kept it from him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. If there were answers to be found, he would have to demand them. Determined, he left his room and made his way to Elizabeth's private lounge, where she often spent her evenings reading. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, heightening the eerie stillness of the mansion. He found her sitting by the large fireplace, a book resting on her lap. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the room, making her face appear both serene and haunted. Elizabeth looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. Jake hesitated for a moment but shook his head. "No, we need to talk," he said firmly. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed slightly. She closed the book and gestured for him to sit. "What's troubling you, Jake?" Jake didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms and faced her directly. "I found the basement," he said, watching for her reaction. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, though she quickly masked her discomfort. "You shouldn't have gone down there," she said quietly. "Yeah, I got that impression," Jake replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I also found your journal. I know about Edward, and about the whispers. What's really going on in this house, Elizabeth? Don't tell me it's just old creaking floors." Elizabeth let out a slow breath, her gaze lowering to the fire. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a voice heavy with sorrow, she spoke. "Edward and I built this life together, but it was never peaceful. He was a troubled man, consumed by his ambitions. In the end, it destroyed him. The night he died, we argued by the pond. I tried to stop him, but..." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "After that, the house changed. Sometimes I hear him, or feel his presence. And I know you have too." The room seemed to darken as her words hung in the air. Jake's anger gave way to a chill of fear. "So, you think he's still here? Like a ghost?" Elizabeth met his gaze, her eyes filled with something between fear and acceptance. "I don't know what to call it, but I've learned that some tragedies leave echoes, and those echoes don't fade easily." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she had said. He wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but after everything he had seen and heard, he couldn't. The house was filled with something that refused to be buried, and now it was pulling him deeper into its grip. Jake couldn't sleep. After his confrontation with Elizabeth, the weight of her words bore down on him. Echoes don't fade easily. He lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the mansion, his thoughts circling back to the night Edward Sinclair had died. The ornamental pond, the argument, the unanswered questions. His instincts told him that whatever was haunting the mansion had started there. If there was a place that held the truth, it was that pond. At dawn, Jake dressed quietly and made his way outside. The air was cold and damp, the first rays of sunlight barely cutting through the thick morning fog that enveloped the grounds. He followed a narrow path lined with overgrown hedges until he reached the pond. The water was still, a glassy surface reflecting the gnarled branches of nearby trees. It looked peaceful, but Jake felt an inexplicable tension in the air, as though the pond itself was holding its breath. He knelt near the edge, scanning the shoreline for any signs of what had happened there decades ago. Something caught his eye, a rusted lantern partially buried in the mud. He pulled it free, his fingers cold and slick with dirt. As he examined it, a flash of memory, no, a vision, invaded his mind. He saw a man, angry and pacing by the water's edge. A woman, possibly Elizabeth, stood nearby, her voice strained with fear. The vision was fleeting, but the intensity of it left Jake gasping for air. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. What was that? He didn't believe in ghosts, but something was undeniably wrong with this place. A sudden noise broke the silence. A splash. Jake whipped around to see ripples spreading across the center of the pond. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure beneath the water, a distorted shadow moving just beneath the surface. He blinked, and it was gone. He stepped closer, his reflection staring back at him from the dark water. The ripples slowed, leaving the pond eerily still once more. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being lured deeper into a mystery he didn't fully understand. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. Jake turned sharply to see Elizabeth standing at the edge of the path, her face pale and solemn. "You came here," she said softly, almost as if she had expected it. "I needed to know the truth," Jake replied. "What really happened that night, Elizabeth?" "I saw something. I felt something." Elizabeth walked closer, her eyes fixed on the pond. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice heavy with resignation, she answered, "The truth is buried here, Jake, and once it surfaces, there's no going back." Elizabeth stood silently beside Jake, her gaze fixed on the pond as if staring into a distant memory. The tension between them was palpable. Finally, she broke the silence. That night, Edward wasn't himself. He was angry, paranoid. He accused me of betrayal, said I was plotting against him. Her voice trembled slightly, though she kept her composure. We argued near the water. He slipped, or maybe he jumped. I tried to save him, but by the time I reached him, it was too late. They called it an accident. But I never believed it was so simple. Jake listened intently, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of truth she was revealing. "And after that?" Jake asked quietly. Elizabeth's face darkened. Strange things began happening. Doors opening on their own, voices in empty rooms, shadows moving where there should have been none. At first, I thought it was my grief playing tricks on me. But over the years, I realized Edward's presence never left this house. Jake shivered as the memory of the whispering voice resurfaced. The house, the pond, and the lingering shadows. They were all connected to that tragic night, and now it was pulling him deeper into its grasp. "Why didn't you leave?" Jake asked. Elizabeth smiled bitterly. "You don't escape a past like this, Jake. Clings to you. I stayed because I thought I could control it. But I was wrong." The air grew colder, and the fog thickened around the pond, as if responding to her words. Suddenly, the water began to ripple, though there was no wind. Jake and Elizabeth both tensed. A dark shape appeared beneath the surface, slowly rising. Jake's breath caught in his throat. At first, it was just a shadow, but then the vague outline of a face emerged. A face that bore an uncanny resemblance to the man in the photograph he had seen. The eyes were hollow, filled with an emotion Jake couldn't define. Anger, sorrow, or perhaps a warning. "Do you see him?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes wide. The figure stared at them for a moment longer before vanishing beneath the water. The pond went still once more, but the weight of its presence lingered. Jake turned to Elizabeth, his voice shaking. "This isn't just a memory, is it? He's still here." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "He doesn't want us to leave until we face the truth." Jake felt the gravity of the situation sink in. The mansion's secrets weren't just stories. They were alive, and they demanded resolution. He realized that if they didn't confront Edward's lingering presence now, they might never escape the grip of the house. "Then we end this tonight," Jake said, determination hardening his voice. Elizabeth's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a spark of hope amidst the fear. Together, they turned toward the mansion, prepared to face whatever darkness awaited them. Night descended on the estate, bringing an unnatural stillness that seemed to weigh on the walls of the mansion. Jake and Elizabeth stood in the dimly lit study, their reflections flickering in the large windows as the fire crackled weakly in the hearth. Elizabeth placed the journal on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "This is where it must happen," she said softly. "He'll come to us here. He always does when the truth is close to the surface." Jake swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. The study felt colder than ever, and shadows crept along the corners of the room like living things. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Minutes passed, then the temperature plummeted. Jake's breath became visible in the air. He glanced at Elizabeth, who stood still as stone, her eyes fixed on the room around them. "Edward," she called softly, her voice echoing unnaturally. "We're here. You don't have to hide anymore. First, there was nothing. But then the shadows shifted. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, materializing near the fireplace. It was Edward, or what was left of him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow but filled with sorrow and anger. The weight of decades pressed down on the room as his gaze locked onto Elizabeth. "Why? Did you let me fall?" Edward's voice was hoarse, echoing with a mournful resonance. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't let you fall. I tried to save you. You were consumed by your fears, your distrust. We destroyed each other that night, and I've lived with that pain ever since." Edward's expression softened for a moment before hardening again. His gaze shifted to Jake. "And you? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "I'm here to help her put this to rest," Jake said firmly, though fear still gripped him. "This place won't let either of us move on until the truth is out." The shadows around Edward began to writhe, as if fueled by the tension. He took a step toward Elizabeth, but this time she stood her ground. "Edward, it's time to let go," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We both need to. You can't keep haunting this place." "Haunting me?" Edward hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. Slowly, the darkness around him began to fade. His face softened as if the anger and pain had finally released their hold on him. He looked at Elizabeth one last time. "I never wanted this. I'm sorry," he whispered before his figure dissolved into the air, leaving only silence behind. The room brightened as the oppressive chill lifted. Jake exhaled shakily, realizing just how tense he had been. Elizabeth wiped a tear from her cheek and turned to him. "It's over," she said quietly. Jake nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief and closure. For the first time since he had entered the mansion, the air felt lighter. They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. The echoes that had haunted the house for so long had finally been laid to rest. Together, they walked out of the study, leaving the darkness behind. In this thrilling and emotional conclusion, the long-awaited peace finally returned to the mansion. Now, it's your turn to be part of this journey. Leave a like if you were moved by Edward's redemption. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling and heartwarming stories like this one. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next tale that will leave you breathless. And share this video with anyone who loves a good mystery. See you in the next video.